Well, good morning, church. Thank you for joining us for our daily Devo. Today, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. You know, I read this passage, and I'm just more convinced how I would have loved to seen Paul in person here on earth. He was such a unique man, someone who was against Christianity, trying to destroy it, then becomes the chief proponent. And you know, we've finished reading Romans. We're in 1 Corinthians now. We're going to read 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. I mean, we're in the midst of books that Paul has written. And the more I read it, and especially this section today in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, the more I'm convinced that Paul was a spiritual and emotionally healthy man. I love this section, especially focusing on verses 3, 4, and 5. First, Paul just tells them, listen, guys, I'm not concerned with how you evaluate or how you judge me. I love that Paul didn't feel trapped by how others saw him. He didn't feel like he had to prove himself to others. But he understood, listen, you can think what you want, but ultimately I stand before God, not before you. And isn't that healthy? I mean, we should want to please people, but we should want to please God more. And we should never be forced in our life to live something that isn't true to us and God because we're trying to please others. But then Paul goes on to say, I love it. He says, but you know, guys, I don't even evaluate or judge myself. In other words, Paul understood that you can feel like you're succeeding. You can feel like you're doing great. You can be self-deceived. But he said, listen, I have to understand one day I stand before God. So he's constantly looking not at what others thought, but God, what do you think? Am I living a life pleasing to you? And then he goes to that last section in verse 5 where he says, hey guys, don't judge others too early. Don't evaluate others. That's God's job, not your job. And I think we have to be challenged as believers to know I'm responsible for me. I'm responsible for my kids that are in my home. I'm responsible for those that are in my life under my responsibility, my accountability. But I'm not responsible for the world. This is not the SBI, the Spiritual Bureau of Investigation. Ultimately, they stand before God, not before me. And it's healthy when we understand that, and it keeps us getting in that mindset of judging others and trying to evaluate others. Paul said, just be careful with that. And I just look at that and say, man, what a great guy Paul was. He understood that he wasn't going to be controlled by the scrutiny of others. He wasn't even going to be self-satisfied thinking he has it all figured out because everything looked good to him. He was going to go to God constantly and reevaluate, but also his job wasn't to judge others. That would be God's job. Man, if we lived that today, how much different would our life be? How much different would those around us be if we lived a life in keeping with what Paul taught there in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Well, guys, I hope you have a blessed day. Thank you so much for being part of our daily Devo. I hope you continue tomorrow.